Hello everyone, today we'll be talking about Kodiak's rural economy. I'm Max Reese and this is for the economies of rural Alaska. So, rural Alaska. Rural Alaska contains a relatively small percent of the population of around 19%, and there are more or less two ways of distinguishing rural Alaska from urban Alaska. That being that it's disconnected from the main road system and marine highway system, and that it's labeled subsistence land. And being disconnected from the urban economy makes relating the central economy to rural Alaska difficult and measuring an issue. So when we talk about Kodiak and the Borough, you can see obviously that Kodiak is in the Gulf of Alaska and it's disconnected from the mainland. The Borough itself includes the island, several islands off the coast, and part of the Alaska Peninsula. And it's mainly because of this disconnect that being able to measure the economy is more difficult in some sense outside of the fishing industry. And so for the actual communities within the region, we're talking about the city of Kodiak and then the villages of Chinook, Uzinki, Port Lions, Old Harbor, Larsen Bay, Karluk, and Okiok. So, and you can see them throughout this photo. Basically as the red dots within the island, and if you notice, they're all along the coast, and that's mainly largely because most of the island is wilderness and actually National Wildlife Refuge, which is the pink area, it's difficult to create communities in those areas. So, talking about the climate and geography, well, the island is mainly comprised of mountainous terrain and green flora, which is why it's got the nickname the Emerald Isles, which is like a hint towards Ireland. And that's mainly because the climate is maritime. So they have mild winters and cool summers, and they average about 67 inches of rainfall a year, which is about double that of the national average. You can see in this photo, obviously, that it's fairly green. So, So how does climate change relate to the region? Well, compared to the rest of the U.S., Kodiak is actually expected to fare well with changing climate, and that's mainly due to where it's located. However, this doesn't necessarily take into account the marine species that are under pressure from climate change and how that actually risks the whole ecosystem. And the major concerns related to that are ocean acidification and warming coastal waters. And while warming coastal waters is kind of more obvious, easy to kind of come up with, but ocean acidification is actually where CO2 emissions are absorbed into the surface water of the ocean and break down into hydrogen and bicarbonate, which increases the acidity of the water. And in particular, we don't necessarily know how ocean acidification plays into the marine life in Kodiak waters, but the general consensus is that, or within the research community, is that ocean acidification is detrimental to fish and shellfish development. And this can be seen, in this table, basically, that, the growth rates of many of these species within the Kodiak region are decreased, and that the survival rate of these species are overall decreasing as well. And this is mainly this mainly affects shellfish because what they require is calcium carbonate to form their shells, which in an acidic environment is basically it just disappears. And this doesn't account for rising temperatures, though, which in a recent study on Pacific cod had a more direct effect on mortality than ocean acidification. And so, that raises concerns of what to focus on, whether it's ocean acidification or rising temperatures in the coastal waters. Even so, there's now an ongoing effort to monitor ocean acidity in Kodiak from water samples taken from Fort Lyons, Old Harbor, Larsen Bay, and Uzinki, so they can get a gauge of what effects will what kinds of species might be affected in those areas. So, talking about the large-scale economy, Kodiak's major economic sector is obviously fishing, but also the Coast Guard and tourism, with the local economy being heavily dependent on the success of the fishing industry. And this dependency on fishing comes at the cost of fluctuations in fish count and the market value of fish. And being a maritime climate and located where it is, fishing is year round and species are diverse, which in this case makes Kodiak more resilient than most fishing industries. However, this past summer in 2024, the fishing industry took a large hit, specifically in Kodiak, because salmon harvests, which is, like I think around roughly a third of their total, annual harvests, was around 9.5 million salmon. And generally, annual harvests are expected to get up to 23.5 million based on previous year estimates. And this led to the industry being dependent on government assistance. Yeah, and to be able to better understand the communities as a whole and how large economic factors play into these small communities, it's important to focus on not only the industry but the local economy. So in particular, how self-sufficient the communities are in the region. So the market foods in Kodiak cost around 200% of that of the national average, and over 95% of the market foods in Kodiak are imported by barge and ferry. So a large portion of what you can buy in the market in the city of Kodiak is fairly expensive, and it can be inconsistent based on whether or not the barge and ferry can actually bring in food. So this issue of dependence on imported foods has raised concerns within the community, which has spurred the development of mariculture, which is basically growing kelp that can be consumed, and community farms, with there actually now being 6 farms developed by the Archipelago Leadership Institute to provide year-round products, within the communities of Kodiak. And so 5 of those are for profits, and so they're selling it, the produce that they have. But one of the community farms is actually producing food for just the community, and actually would fall under subsistence. But this doesn't account for communities that are solely dependent on subsistence for food. Subsistence, a relatively old review that I found, talking about the communities of Akiuk, Karluk, Larsen Bay, Old Harbor, and Zinke, and Port Lions, found that engagement in subsistent harvests is relatively high. So they're relatively actually dependent on fish, which isn't necessarily a super big surprise, as it's a maritime climate. But this is based on a paper that I found between 1980 and 1990. So that's relatively old, but it seems to be more consistent with recent data, which appears to show that more than half of pounds per capita of wild resources harvested are fish, and a portion of that being salmon. So and it's relatively still a lot of subsistence per person, basically. And you can kind of see this on this graph that the pounds usable weight per person, and Kodiak is still relatively high, with a large portion of it just being fish. So obviously that comes into concerns with the changing climate, and the salmon harvest being relatively low. But another great way of being able to measure the economy is renewable energy. So power generation, it began as early as 1984 or renewable energy power generation began as early as 1984 in Kodiak with the Terror Lake hydroelectric project, and has since developed to the point where they can solely rely on hydroelectric facilities that they have and 9 wind turbines to generate the power for the community and commercial market. And around 80 to 85% of that annual power comes from the hydroelectric facility they have, with the remaining percent being created through the wind turbines. So more recently, there have been more developments into finding ways to store this power more efficiently, and this includes introducing lithium batteries and diverting more streams into the hydroelectric facility, so that they can be even more self-sufficient. And even though that they are becoming self-sufficient, the costs of basically power is still relatively high compared to the national average, but that it makes sense based because they're kind of disconnected from this urban areas basically, and so power is still going to be relatively expensive. Um, so the key takeaways is that Kodiak is obviously part of rural Alaska. It's off the Gulf, and it's you know disconnected in a lot of ways, and so and climate. As the climate changes, it may harm species that are kind of integral to subsistence, and obviously the formal economy. So basically, the fishing industry. And because of this, the fishing industry will most likely change as, I didn't necessarily bring this up, but as different species become more prominent and other species less prominent. So, Pacific cod and salmon are most likely going to change, and obviously shellfish might start to disappear, and so other species, will most likely come up and become more prominent. And obviously, this also has to, influence the local communities, and to be able to measure that, we got to understand how, they're self-sufficient, and based on what I've seen, is basically that they're changed to be even more self-sufficient. Whether that's through power generation, or it's through the market. But it can also be considered through subsistence, which I didn't necessarily find any specific information about that, but it's still largely dependent on subsistence. So, yeah, those are just kind of the main takeaways of the rural economies in Kodiak region. So, thank you.